I think we're going to move on to this issue, the second issue, climate change, water sanitation and hygiene. And this will be presented by the lead author of this report, who's Roger Calow from ODI. He's head of ODI's Water Policy Programme, honorary research associate at the British Geological Survey, and director of the DFID-funded Ripple Consortium, which is a research programme on this WASH issue, and is based in Ethiopia. Roger, over to you.
Thank you, Karen. Welcome everybody. I know that not everyone here is an expert on water, sanitation, hygiene, water resources, so I'll try and craft my messages appropriately. Just a quick intro. I head up the Water Policy Programme here at ODI, WPP. Have done over the last couple of years a lot of work on climate change. That spans impacts on services, but also impacts on resources. There's a good geographical spread. Most of the literature is out there, including some advisory work we do for the Chinese government, indirectly with UK and Swiss government support, but also some of the findings from the Ripple programme in Ethiopia. Anyway, the report I'm going to talk about today is the one you have on the middle of the screen there. It's called Climate Change, Water Resources and WASH, a scoping study. The executive summary, which looks, it isn't this one, but it looks identical to that, is out there, so do pick up a copy. The main report is online. It's quite a hefty one, around 70, 80 pages. It was commissioned by WaterAid in the UK, funded by them. It was work that we did in collaboration with scientists from the British Geological Survey. We have a long history of doing that. So it's a mix of the science, but also the policy and the practice for a non-specialist audience. Let me tell you what I'm going to talk briefly about now. I'll give you a quick overview of the current status on water supply, sanitation and health. Just a few facts and figures. I'll then go on to talk about climate change and water, looking at the evidence, uncertainties and perspectives we have. Thirdly, impacts on WASH infrastructure and services. And finally, something about responses and this question of what exactly does adaptation mean in practice, and does it imply a different approach or different approaches to water supply and sanitation planning and management. Firstly, a little bit of context. These are figures from the WHO UNICEF Joint Monitoring Programme 2010, a kind of update on progress towards MDG 7 on improved drinking water and sanitation. Take the diagram on your left. A quick overview. Globally, progress towards the drinking water target is more or less on track. But that figure is skewed by very good progress in India and China in particular. So the deficit, as the title on that diagram makes clear, and the greatest challenge, is extending access to improved drinking water in sub-Saharan Africa. Despite the somewhat gloomy arithmetic, nonetheless there are some real success stories there. Uganda, one of the case studies actually written up, you'll find it on the WPP site. Malawi, Ghana, Ethiopia arguably also a success story given the low levels from which it started. It's marked there as a red, less than 50%. The government figures would be a little bit higher than that. But I think shifting over to sanitation, I mean that's the really big challenge, and that's the really big off-track one. I presented those figures in a slightly different way, but you know, I think the numbers speak for themselves. 2.6 billion, most of those in Asia, but big deficits and challenges also in sub-Saharan Africa. Why would be a subject of a separate meeting, a separate debate, probably lasting several days. And there are many reasons. In truth, funding, a point raised, I think, by both Lily and the Minister, which is absorptive capacity. It's not just money, it's also about the ability to use it. We see that in Ethiopia with some very low expenditure rates. It's about domestic priorities. It's also about the proportion of overseas development assistance that goes, in fact, to water and sanitation in the poorest countries. It's also about the sustainability crisis, because it's all very well throwing money at water and sanitation infrastructure. The problem is you also have to sustain it afterwards, and that is a really big challenge. But the final point I wanted to make here is you won't see a nice, neat causal relationship between access to water and the water resource endowments of a country, measured using the common metrics, the sort of Falkenmark indicators of water stress, water scarcity, absolute scarcity. So that would be renewable water resources availability per capita. No neat relationship between water resources availability and access, and in parallel, no neat relationship between the water resources endowment of a country or their economic performance. I mention that because I'm going to come back, because a lot of the climate change debates we have around water are very environmentally deterministic, in that they assume climate change is all about physical scarcity and the fact that we're somehow going to run out. That is a gross simplification of the reality. So next, as best I can, summarise the science in one slide. There's quite a bit of this in the main report, so do go and have a look at that if you're interested. But in short, good confidence on temperature. I mean, higher projections than we thought when the IPCC fourth assessment was being made. The next one, which is going to be 2013, I think, will probably be looking at a 4 degrees C rise by the end of the century. Much less confidence on rainfall for various reasons, but nonetheless we can say changes in flow regimes, recharge patterns, that would be groundwater recharge, water quality, not just chemistry but also turbidity, and also extreme events, the volatility or flashiness of systems. And hydrologists tend to talk about an intensification of existing variability. But there are these big uncertainties, mainly around rainfall and trying to downscale it, particularly over continental interiors. And then the chain of uncertainty increases as we take the GCM models, take the rainfall, and then try and derive results and impacts down through hydrological models and hydrogeological models. So the level of uncertainty increases, particularly at the spatial scales that are relevant to decision making on WASH. So I mentioned in the previous slide, given that complexity, why is it, I think, that the climate change debate around water tends to have a very narrow lens and a very narrow perspective on physical scarcity and the metrics that measure it? I think we could argue that one out. I think it's often convenient to blame problems on climate change. If you don't have water coming out of a tap, that's climate change. It's scapegoated often, but I'm going to leave that one alone, move on to what I would call a slightly more balanced perspective, and the parallel perhaps with debates on food security, which long ago moved away from a preoccupation with food availability and supply measured at national scale towards arguments about access and entitlements measured or assessed at the household level. But stick to the supply side first. Let's not just talk about aggregate numbers, water availability per capita. Well, we've got to capture this issue of variability, of uncertainty and scale, and on the demand side, as I said, issues around access and entitlements, not least because if you go back to the first diagram which showed coverage and progress against MDG 7 that is only explicable if we look at this second part, access and entitlements. It's not all about built infrastructure. We also have natural infrastructure which we need to recognise, manage and protect. Groundwater storage is an obvious one. This figure is drawn from a report that will be out shortly from the British Geological Survey. There's quite a few details up on their website, actually, if you type in groundwater resilience. But one of the big uncertainties around the impacts of climate change on domestic water supply in Africa is on the groundwater stocks that most rural people depend on, and Africa is still a predominantly rural continent. I think the tipping point will come around 2030. We have probably, now that we've quantified it for the first time, or at least BGS has, rather higher storage than hitherto thought. 0.5 to 1 million cubic kilometres is a big number. That's dominated by major storage in the North African basins. So those are the dark colours at the top of the screen. Also the big sedimentary basins you'll see going down the spine, right down through to the Karoo basin at the bottom, to the big Nubian sandstone basin at the top. So although it's dominated by North African basins, and we see the dark colours illustrating the big sedimentary basins, which incidentally give you the major storage that doesn't correspond neatly to the population density I've shown you on there. We also have more storage perhaps than hitherto thought in some of the shallower aquifers, and often up to 20 times more storage than used annually in a hand pump. So we're not going to run out of water by pulling out water for domestic uses from hand pumps. Okay? There are many problems with domestic water supplies in sub-Saharan Africa and hand pumps failing, but to immediately jump to the conclusion that water tables are falling and we've run out is a little bit hasty. So, does this conclusion still hold? The Human Development Report, UNDP 2006, I think so. I think it was a good conclusion from one of the better reports I've seen on water. And in fact, the latest edition of Water International Journal, I think, reaches pretty much the same conclusion on the bulk water allocations in some of the major river basins of the world, including the Yellow, the Ganges, the Nile, and so on. Efficiency, equity, access. Impacts on infrastructure and services. Important to mention here, I think that climate change doesn't change the nature of basic threats to services. It does change their severity, their frequency, their timing, and in some cases their geographical spread. Let's pare it right back down to a few basics. Flooding. The Minister mentioned some of the impacts on infrastructure and natural resources in Rwanda. Infrastructure damage, the obvious one. The breaching of sanitary protection measures and the short-circuiting of waste flows into wells and boreholes is a real danger. Siltation, another one. In terms of droughts or extended dry periods, reduced water availability, yes. Threats to shallow wells that rely on more contemporary recharge, rainwater harvesting schemes and their resilience, also the operation and maintenance of sewerage systems, the kind of gold standard, the water-based ones, and a problem of less dilution or environmental absorption. Indirect effects, I think we should probably not forget. Energy interruptions that will affect pumping and water treatment. Also the risk mentioned, I think by Lily, saline intrusion from rising sea levels combined with intensive use of groundwater, for example. You can see those problems in northeast China and India now. But it's not always an intuitive argument, especially when we're dealing with areas that are projected to have less rainfall in the future. I'll give you a couple of examples, but the reasons are to do with complex feedbacks and mediating factors. But the biggest climate change globally, within written records that Professor Richard Carter at WaterAid has written about, is the decline in rainfall in the Western Africa in the Sahel region since roughly 1960. Yet at the same time, that kind of 3-4 decade reduction in rainfall has been associated with increases in river discharges and increases in water levels. Why? Because we have mediating factors around soil and land use. So you don't always get a neat relationship. The same could also be said of groundwater recharge. Go back to that previous diagram. The assumption that less long-term average rainfall means less groundwater to sustain, for example, domestic water supplies in Africa is an argument you have to make very carefully, because groundwater recharge depends as much or more on intra-annual variability. We keep coming back to variability. So the timing, intensity and duration of rainfall events, not long-term averages.
4 minutes.
Thank you. So in responses, this question I put up at the beginning, what does adaptation mean in practice? I would classify it as business as usual, but better, to which people will say, no, climate change is not about business as usual, it's new thinking. We, the authors, would disagree, because so much of this is about plugging the existing adaptation deficit, which will in turn increase resilience and reduce vulnerability to future stresses. And not just climate change in isolation. Climate change is one stress amongst many others. We have population growth, urbanization, land use change, higher patterns and levels of consumption, and so on and so forth. A couple of quick things I'll pick out. Resource assessment and monitoring. Massive deficit in terms of observational observations, I was going to say, but measurement in terms of both resource conditions and what's actually working. Governance, especially at local level, the functionality of infrastructure. Ethiopia, possibly somewhere between 20–40% of systems not working. So, address functionality, build in redundancy or headroom. This issue of protecting sources from flood risk, increased sanitary protection measures. I don't think we should be excluding particular technologies. I know that's an argument made by some. I think we have to look much more in terms of mixed baskets with mixed risk profiles, providing water for a range of different uses, rather than trying to put everything onto one community source. And finally, investments in storage that Peter will take up, because there is going to be a big renewed emphasis in investing in hydraulic infrastructure, not just storage but also conveyance, to buffer climate variability. You can see this happening in Ethiopia at the moment, and whatever the reservations of the traditional donors, you'll see the non-traditional ones, the Chinese and others, stepping in and providing that finance.
1 minute.
So conclusions. This issue. First, climate change is not happening in isolation. It's one of a number of pressures and stresses. So let's not separate it out and treat it as something that in the WASH sphere requires a unique set of approaches and toolkits. I don't think it does. Extending access to safe, reliable water remains key, not just to addressing current climate variability, which is a massive challenge in countries like Ethiopia, but also future climate change. And a lot of this, I think, not all, but a lot, is about addressing the bottlenecks we know about. Characterizing resources, monitoring, dealing with this issue of source and infrastructure sustainability, and recognizing that we will require not just investments in natural storage and protection, but much more investment in built infrastructure. Doesn't have to be big dams, it can be distributed at a range of different scales, but it's buffering capacity that is needed. Thank you.